everyone. Thanks very much for joining us today on this panel. I'm really looking forward to hearing from each of our speakers. And thanks for joining us in this after lunch slot. My name's Ailidh Callander. I'm a lawyer at Privacy International. We're an NGO based in London that fights corporate and state surveillance and data exploitation. Last year, one of the things Privacy International did was file complaints against 7 data broker and ad tech companies and credit reference agencies with data protection authorities in France, Ireland, and the UK. These complaints targeted companies that, despite exploiting the data of millions of people, receive very little public attention and scrutiny and have received very little challenge to their practices. But in their drive to create targeted advertising, they collect ever more data from us, creating vast numbers of profiles. And it's a really hard ecosystem to uncover, but even harder to challenge. But today, we have some panelists that have some ideas and have started. And you can see here this excellent graphic by Wolfie Crystal in his report for Cracked Labs. And as he says here, every industry today is taking part in this ever more pervasive data ecosystem. But who are these actors and how can they be challenged? There's just so many of them, so very many. But at the same time, we have legal protections and journalists and civil society pushing back. So I'm really happy to be here with the panel today. Our moderator is Aliya. She's a journalist from the Financial Times covering tech, and she's covered these issues very recently. We also have Johnny Ryan, who's the Chief Policy and Industry Relations Officer for Brave, a privacy-friendly browser. We've got Katarzyna Szymielewicz. She's an activist and lawyer specializing in human rights and technology. She's the co-founder of Panoptikon, working in Poland, challenging surveillance. And she's had some recent action on Monday, joining complaints that Johnny and Jim Killick and Michael Veal were also part of in the UK and Ireland. We have Paul-Olivier Dehaye, who's the founder of Personal Data IO, and he's created a service that helps individuals exercise their data rights. And we also have artist and researcher Joana Moll, who's here to share a bit of her work. She's an artist and critically explores the way post-capitalist narratives affect the alphabetization of machines, humans, and ecosystems. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from all of them and the ideas they have and their experience so far in uncovering this ecosystem.
Thanks very much, Ailidh. This is a huge topic right now, which is, I'm sure, why all of you are here. And the members of this panel are among the people who have been the earliest to take action. Vera Jourova described GDPR as a loaded gun in the hand of regulators. And I think some of these guys have provided targets. So the question now is, will they shoot? Businesses are already really worried about businesses that participate in the kind of data economy are already taking quite a lot of steps and are quite worried about the possibility of regulatory action. There are loads of examples. One of them is Axiom, which sold off the more controversial side of its business, which does identity resolution. LiveRamp, there are lots more examples. But still, there are kind of huge areas of the digital economy that are incredibly opaque, not just to ordinary people, but also to the businesses that participate in them. So if you talk to app developers, for example, they're often not aware that when they sign up to analytics services, those analytics services kind of transfer data wholesale, their users' data wholesale out of the app. I wasn't aware until this week that the categories that enable real-time bidding to occur often describe the content on websites according to categories that are kind of highly suggestive of personal things like depression or blood disorders or infertility. I'm sure panelists will talk about that in a bit. So we all have loads of questions. How useful is this data? Is it oversold? How can the internet stay free without it? So anyway, without wasting any more time, I just want to hand over to the panelists to introduce themselves, starting with Katarzyna.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me here. I really have great pleasure sharing this panel with friends, activists, and people I admire for their work. And I'm glad we are not alone, because this target we have here, the online advertising ecosystem, is a moving target and extremely, as you can see still on the picture, extremely complex target. So not a single organization, not a single activist could handle it on their own. Panoptikon indeed joined this effort last year, and we spent almost a year. Actually, we started before GDPR was fully operational in May last year, asking companies that we expected to have our profiles, our marketing profiles, all around this data, hidden data ecosystem. And I have to confess today that the results are extremely disappointing, and this is why we ended up filing legal complaints that I will come back to in 2 minutes. But before I do that, let me explain you a bit better why we made that effort. Basically, what we expected at Panoptikon to reveal is something like this structure. We expect that every individual using online services and technology does have an online profile, which is a layered structure. Obviously, it is composed of data we share, data that we can control. It might be difficult in practice because we sleep and live and walk and think with our devices, so we obviously do not control everything we put there. But yes, at least in theory, the data we share is the data we control. And this is also the data that we can practically obtain from companies if we ask them. Maybe not once, maybe you have to repeat this question, but you are likely to get this data. What you are less likely to get, unfortunately, is second and third layer of your profile. Second, in my metaphor, is composed of data reflecting your behavior, data reflecting how you use devices, how you use websites, the time patterns, interactions, ignored content, and all those things that we really do not control. Still, it is theoretically possible, but extremely difficult. It's almost like hacking this ecosystem to try and control this second layer, which is basically behavioral analysis. And this is the data that, in my experience, can be obtained from some companies, the more progressive ones. I will show you an example in a minute. The third layer, the most interesting one that we all suspect to have, which is composed of inferred data, the data that we have never provided, the data that is not observed, the data that was created or generated by algorithms on the basis of layer first and layer of layer 1 and layer 2. So essentially, this is interpretation of our behavior, interpretation that we might disagree with, that might be confusing, that might be discriminatory, that might be sensitive, right? By reading online content about certain disease, we might get labeled with that disease, which might be simply not true. But nevertheless, as evidence that I think John Ryan will explain later, shows is part of that OBA ecosystem. We get labeled on the basis of things we do online, and nobody cares if that label is true or not. So that's the third layer that we would really like to uncover, but it proves extremely difficult because companies creating those layers, they have certain arguments. Either they argue that they do not know who we are. So if we try to target hidden players in this data ecosystem, not Google, not websites we know, but data brokers whose names are less famous, their usual response to the very many data access requests that we sent to them over last year is, we never heard of you, user. Because me as a user, I don't know which number, which ID they have with my data in their database. It's catch-22 situation. Since I don't know this number, even though I can expect it exists, I cannot really ask them to provide me my profile. And they have very easy escape by saying, we never heard about you. Send us, I think it was Quancast who we asked this question, told us, please send me a paper copy of your ID to France. I don't know why to France, and we will check. It's ridiculous. Of course, everybody knows it's not my paper ID that matters here. It's not my surname that matters. It's my advertising ID that I will never discover because they're hiding it from me. So essentially getting to that very essence of profile is very difficult because of how the system is designed, how it was designed by the key players such as Google and AIB, who we decided to target in our complaints. I will show you, before I conclude with complaints, what we uncovered in our investigation. This is example of I think Facebook's advertising profile, the way they reveal it, yes, the way they believe users should be satisfied by seeing something like this. Well, we are not satisfied by seeing something like this because we obviously know they have much more granular, much more sensitive data on us. What we got from a Polish company called Wirtualna Polska, one of very popular news sites in Poland, by asking them to show us our marketing profile, we got something like this. We got a table full of very difficult data to interpret unless you are a data scientist. When we got deeper, what we realized it shows certain patterns, behavioral patterns. It shows, for example, the pattern of websites that the person to whom that data belongs visited and how that person moves between websites. So it clearly shows interesting behavioral pattern. Or what it shows this, which is a heat map of interactions with a service, yes? How often, how frequently, at which times of the day and night that person was using the service. So yes, clearly the data we can get reflect our behavior with those, our interactions with those services. But what none of this data shows is, of course, what we want to get. The profile, the interpretation layer. The third most interesting layer remains hidden. And this is why, at the end of our endeavor, we ended up with this, filing complaints against, as I said before, companies who organize this ecosystem, which in our belief, these are Google and AIB because they set technical standards for online behavioral advertising systems, as those who actually should be responsible, maybe not for replying to our questions. I understand that they might not have my data, but they certainly can change rules of this ecosystem so that I can control my data, which turned out to be impossible when we followed particular players.
Thank you very much. That's really fascinating. And Paul, if you want to talk next, I know you've submitted more subject access requests than maybe everyone in this room put together.
Yeah, so I wanted to talk about what I think will be necessary fairly soon to get lots of different actors in civil society to work together to very effectively use data subject rights to contribute to enforcing the GDPR. So basically, my observation is that there are many different actors like academics, activists, NGOs, the media as well, who are interested, who are represented in this panel and who are interested in those issues. But they each have their own logic on producing information about this ecosystem, but no good way to federate, no good way yet to federate this knowledge and to make it very actionable for the data subjects ultimately, who are the persons affected. So the model I would like to experiment on with people here, but also their networks outside of this room and activists all over the world, all over Europe, is one that's built on a collaborative model around Wikidata, which is for those who, how many of you know Wikidata by any chance? So it's the database that anyone can edit. It's basically on the model of Wikipedia. So the idea, why is it? Right. So this is the Deliveroo page. Anyone can go there right now and correct it or improve it. Or anyone can go to any other Uber Eats or similar services and can have a look. And at the bottom, you see that there is an entry that says that it's an instance of a data controller subject to the GDPR. That doesn't tell you much, but somewhere in there There's an email address in the middle. So this is, I think it's the email address. I cannot see very well. Yes. So the email address for the data protection officer at this company. And here there's all kind of different data that this company is using. That's just me entering information. But of course, Katarzyna could enter information that she acquires over time on which data points this company is using, for what purpose, maybe, thank you very much, maybe the legal basis for doing so. So you can see here, I don't remember what I entered, but a user account, a phone number, different behavioral patterns that are collected, and the way it has been, different data points that are processed, and the way it has been obtained, either through collection or inference, like was just explained. And you can also see, I don't remember what that is, but other data points that are relevant. Just go, oh yes, and one important element at the bottom is the Android app ID. So the ID in a separate database for their Android app, which allows to connect to a lot of researchers that are doing reverse engineering of apps to figure out what those apps are using, what SDKs they're using, things like that, along the lines of the Privacy International recent effort. So why would you want to do this map? Well, the first step is to say, because it will be useful to other people and not be focused on one end use right away. Others can build on top of this map, and progressively it will reduce the cost for building privacy-preserving services or services helping activists or generally civil society. That in itself is important. And I skipped one slide, which was showing a prototype of a tool that helps to generate access requests. It's not meant to be a general market tool yet. It's meant to be more for activists all over the world, decentralized around those ideas. It's not meant to be for the general public, because my assumption is that anyone in this room knows someone who is interested in data and who will know the most popular tool to analyze this data, will know how to use it. That tool is called Jupyter. So if I build a tool that is on top of Jupyter, what's called a notebook, then it would be easy for anyone in this room to find a Jupyter user that could help them use it. It has more viral potential, if you want. And what's the end goal at this stage? It's a very limited end goal, but it's to build basically the best crafted subject access request that you can for that particular controller and that particular data subject. What does that mean? That means that it aggregates information about the data controller from all kinds of different sources, but it also has a view towards the process after the request. When do you have to send a reminder? We'll send you an event in your calendar that corresponds to that. Where do you file a complaint? We'll prepare the email for you to do that once it's not satisfied. Who should you refer to? We'll enter the NGO email address that you should contact in these circumstances, to basically make it easier and easier for more people to engage into using their access right, while understanding that they are surrounded by civil society who want to help them.
Thank you. So it sounds like you're talking about a kind of data map, is that right? Which so everyone kind of submits these access requests and uploads information.
Right. So a map is just one view on the database that I'm talking about, but it's a view that has very little further reuse. Well, if you have a database that anyone can edit and use, it allows for a lot more reuse for this map.
Right. So moving on to Johnny, maybe you want to start by also telling us about the response the IAB had to the complaint that you and Katarzyna filed just this week.
If you don't mind, maybe we'll leave the response to that until a little bit later, because there's some specifics that I'd like to get to at the beginning, let's say some of the basics. Also, it's a nice chance for me to thank PI for the invitation to be here and to applaud them for all their work so far. Before we get into what the IAB and we are having an argument about, which is about bid requests and the ad auction system, let's think first where the data brokers came from, right? They start off in the 1800s in small towns as ledgers showing who borrowed what from who. Very simple, pen and paper, and they were absolutely essential. That was the credit rating industry. And then 50s, 60s, the photocopier is invented. What an amazing thing to happen. And with the invention of the photocopier, you can get whatever court records or property documents you can get your hands on and put them in a filing cabinet somewhere and get the skinny on someone and sell that on to, whoever will pay you. And from 2010, something really magical happened for the data brokers. Truly magical. It only happened slowly, but now it's got to a very big scale. And that change was ad auctions. Have you heard that quote from Arthur C. Clarke, a guy with a very searching mind, a science fiction writer? When he first encountered the web, he realized it was dangerous for his intellect because there were so many things on the web. He said it was like drinking from the falls of Niagara. You couldn't take all the stuff it was giving you, unless you're the data broker industry, in which case you'll take it with all of the octopus arms at your disposal. Now, where we're at with ad auctions today is that when you visit a website, right, when you visit a website in your browser or when you use an app, actually that applies to apps as well, on your phone, more often than not, far more often than not, each empty ad unit makes a little communication to another company called an ad exchange. And that communication can contain many different things. It will almost certainly contain what you're watching, what you're looking at, or what you're listening to online. That makes sense, actually. But it will also contain things like your location, which could be down to the zip code, or it could be down to the GPS coordinate. Now, every time someone's loading a web page, just imagine the possibility that their GPS is being sent along with what they're looking at. But that's not all. It could be year of birth, gender. There are 2 documents that specify what can be in a bid request. Only 2. The entire industry is governed by 2 documents. One is defined by the IAB, the other is defined by Google. Conveniently, Google also uses the IAB's document. Now, from these bid requests, you know specific re-identifiable information about the person's device. You know what they're looking at. You know the categories that what they're looking at fit into, which could be, it could be benign. Tesla Motors is a nice benign example, or it could be thyroid cancer, or it could be Christianity. It could easily be Article 9 special category data. So what I've described is an evolution from the ledger of a small town to the photocopier box to the bid request in ad exchanges, which happens to be something that affects us all in the room. At what scale, you might wonder? Has this happened to me at least once in the last week? The answer is definitely, because one person's saying no, maybe they're blocking, but for nearly everyone, the answer is well over 100 a day. Right? So the New Economics Foundation, I think it's a low estimate, estimates that in the UK, the average internet user has their personal data broadcast 164 times a day to an unknown number of companies. We have no idea where these data go. So in my final 40 seconds, let me say, there's an easy way to strangle this hoovering exercise of what everyone is looking at online, their browsing history. The web is one of those things where you don't want people to know what you're looking at on it. That's one thing we know for sure. And the way to strangle the industry's access to our browsing history is simply to require that the industry, in those 2 sets of rules, mandates that there can be no personal data in the bid request. You can still have ad auctions, provided no one can identify the person who's on a website. You can have non-personal data. So let me run slightly over time and say, this is currently before the DPAs in Poland, brilliantly, in the UK and in Ireland, and it should be in front of other DPAs too. And I think together we would invite anyone in this room who is interested in this to talk to us afterwards, to keep this pressure up and to strangle the data brokers at source in the bid requests. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And finally, Joana, who I think one of the more interesting things I've noticed she's done recently is buy 1 million dating profiles off the internet for 136 euros. So, Joana.
Yeah, can you put the browser on? Well, yeah, exactly. Well, that's the project that basically explains what Aliya just mentioned. So yeah, I could buy 1 million online dating profiles for 136 euros in May 2017. This project I did in collaboration with Tactical Tech Collective. And what we got with all these bytes that we bought It's not the only one that we bought, because I bought just one after GDPR, just 3 months ago. I still got the same data. So it was like very detailed descriptions of people, including names, including usernames, emails, birth data, sexual orientation, detailed description of interest, education, and much more physical description, even the eye color, hair type, complexity, weight, and so on. Yeah, along with 5 pictures for each profile. So altogether, 136 euros, we got 5 million pictures of people, which is it's quite grotesque, right? Yeah. So yeah, the project is just here. You can, if it's called the Dating Brokers, you will find it pretty easy on the internet if you want to check it out. And then the other second thing, and if you can switch screens now, that I want to mention, because there's all this data broker ecosystem, which, as obviously we said, it's highly invisible, yeah. But invisibility, it just not affect us in terms of rights, privacy, and so on. But it's also about its environmental impact, because there is all these processes that happen beyond the interface, right? Because the internet is a massive infrastructure that is quite invisible, right? And we just access it through interfaces. So I like always to point out that all these processes that are beyond the interface are highly polluting. And it's something that we don't really have in our imagination, right? It's not something that's really accepted in our social imagination. So again, like everything that has to deal with surveillance, with all these transactions, sort of illegal, legal, in gray area transactions of data, such the ones that...
How did you calculate that number?
This number, it's a little bit tricky, because the internet is the biggest thing that we ever built. It's composed by a massive number of things, right? It's really, really, really hard to get an accurate number, but according to several articles that papers that have been published, they were published in 2008, the one that I used, they stated that more or less 1 megabyte of data, the transaction of 1 megabyte of data equals 7,072 grams of CO2. Yeah? So just imagine, every time we visit any website, it's not just about the content that it's loading, but it's just about all the things that happen, like all this data that is being sent to the ad exchange, yeah? All this information that's been sent to multiple data brokers that nobody knows how many and how much, right? So this is a thing, that's why it's really, really important also to uncover all this hidden ecosystem, yeah, to control the environmental impact of it. Yeah. Thanks.
Thanks, Joana. So I seem to be surrounded by a kind of consensus that the way that the data economy functions right now is infringing upon our rights as to have private lives and as citizens. But the major counter-argument to it, and the counter-argument that Google would make, or all the tech companies make, is that it is this data economy that keeps the internet free, and what we have right now is an ad-funded internet. So if the internet wasn't funded by ads, what would it be funded by, and how much would you guys be willing to pay?
Do you mind if I answer that? I'm not sure if anyone here is suggesting that ads should go away. I'm not suggesting that at all. Just to be clear, I used to work for an ad tech company whose sole reason for existence was to prevent people blocking ads. That's my background. Because before that, I used to work for a publisher whose journalism was supported by advertising. So I'm not going to be painted as the IAB would want. This is the ad tech trade body. I wouldn't let myself be painted as someone who's against advertising. I'm not against it. The question is, do we need to have ads that are a race to the bottom of surveillance, or can we have actually a much better functioning, interesting verb, a much better functioning ad market, interesting, a much better functioning market where the journalism is supported by ads and the value is coming from the publisher, not from the ad tech distribution system. And today in the market, the ad tech distribution system hoovers up, let's better invent another verb there, hoovers up between 70 and 55% of every ad euro spent, right? There's good sources for those figures. If we remove the surveillance bit that distribution provides, if we make it a dumber system that still is good ad targeting but it affects no one's rights, actually the publisher will make more money.
But the way that publishers sell their ad space is by claiming a level of detail and specificity about what they can tell the brand about the person looking at that web page. So intermediaries or not, it is the publishers as well and the websites as well that are participating in this.
I know that Kat's itching to get in with a better answer than I'm going to give, but I'm going to give my answer first anyway. So, okay, I used to work for a publisher. Here's what they do. They try and sell most of their ad inventory, eyeballs, directly to Audi, for example. But there's an awful lot of inventory that they can't sell, and smaller publishers may not even be able to sell any inventory directly. So what they try to do is they say, we have the following type of person on our property. Does anyone want to find that type of person on our property? Now, once you've found someone on the FT or any other publication using that method, you can find the same person again when they then move off to bikinibabes.com. So this system, which is very efficient in theory and could be very efficient if it were cleaned up, this system allows for the arbitrage and essentially strip mining of publishers' unique audiences so that they can be retargeted cheaper elsewhere.
I just want to add again to this excellent argument that I strongly agree with, that the thing we are fighting for is not really to prevent data flowing as such. It's not about killing data flows. It's about putting user in the position of controller here. So I can imagine even myself being a user who actually wants to be targeted for a certain specific ad if I'm actually interested in finding specific good, right? I have nothing against people targeting me the very moment I'm prepared for this, and with data that I'm willing to share. So, for example, if it's shoes I'm trying to buy or laptop because I want to change one, why not? But if it's my mental health or my disease or my me as a parent or my child and his or her health, I don't want that. So really what we're trying to fight for is transparency here and control, enabling this conversation to happen. Conversation that should happen between website and a user, and not between user and endless number of companies who will never have the dialogue, because the very essence of their business is to operate behind the screen, right? So we want to force, in a way, companies that need our money, publishers, to have this open conversation with us about profiles that we accept and the type of targeting we want to, we are happy to have, to experience. It could be contextual as well. It doesn't have to be very personal and even less intimate.
Paul, do you want?
Yeah, I want to add that in some circumstances, you actually have readers who want to give data to the journalists or the publishers. I mean, it's emerging, but something like the Correspondent in the Netherlands, they are on a subscription model, but their model is to really talk to their audience, work with them on stories and all of those things. So they encourage the audience to submit information about themselves so that they can have sources in their own audience, and they can build better stories thanks to that. So there's still a model where they are collecting data. People are willing to give data to publishers if they get something in return. Mm-hmm. So I'm not saying the Correspondent will turn to an ad-based model. Why would they do it, since they're so unique for the moment? But you can imagine mixed models. As long as there is transparency, people will be willing to give some data to journalists to fund their work.
And what about moving on from publishers and journalism and looking at all the other services on the internet that are free, like search or social networks?
I think both are showing that there is inherent problems with the free model, because they're distorting markets. I'm not an expert in that, but there's a lot of problems behind.
Just interesting argument from Google. If you question them about privacy, they usually say, with search, we need no personal data. We do not do any personal data processing because we have the context. It's actually contextual ad in search engines are a very good proof that this model can be done without identifying people. Because when we search for something, we give all the context that is necessary to present extremely relevant ad. And Google, I'm not here to judge whether they are right or wrong saying this, but I can believe that they do not process more. Why would they take more if they have everything in the search query? Mm-hmm. So even their behavior shows that this is possible.
But you have the companies that have provided, that have kind of transformed the way that we live by providing free access to masses and masses of information, saying that if we can't target users with ads in a certain way, the internet won't be able to continue to be free.
Just to add, I think something that we've really noticed as well is that the level of granularity has increased. Like many of these services existed 10 years ago, but the level of like the granularity of the data that's collected, and also as we were talking about the profiles that are generated, it's incremental, and also it's about transparency, but also accountability in this issue that it's the interlinked nature of it. Perhaps it's Facebook, but then Facebook uses Experian or Oracle or Axiom as a data provider. It's the data's the rich part for them, but it's the interlinked nature that makes it very difficult for individuals to take control. But at the moment, without further scrutiny and action, it's very difficult for individuals to kind of have that accountability and control.
And do you think that some of the services that we've seen being launched, privacy-first services like DuckDuckGo, or there's many alternatives, Proton Mail, there's many alternatives to the kind of big services created by the tech companies that are ad-funded. Do you think that these will ultimately, in 10 or 15 years, become the norm as awareness increases?
I think what needs to happen is action as over awareness. Awareness is part of it, but also action in holding those that currently do not fill the legal requirements that we have already, holding those to account, and limiting the use of the data.
Can I come back? You presented that argument that the other side, let's call them, our colleagues in AdTech and so forth, often offer. You know, we humans benefit from these wonderful new services which are free, and therefore we should bend over and take whatever treatment we are given. They also said before the GDPR arrived that if the GDPR happened, the sky would fall. And they said the same thing before and before and before. These people think the sky is always going to fall, or at least that's what they tell the press and the regulator. Well, we now know that that is not the case. The sky has not fallen. And what else we know about these companies is that they operate with enormous margins and are absurdly profitable. If anyone can take a gamble, a very tiny gamble, I'm not sure it's a gamble at all, for the future of society, they can. The people who cannot are the publishers of worthy media. It's the newspapers who are dying here under the status quo. They need something different. The ad tech side is winning hand over fist. They don't want to see any change at all. I think that's why they make that argument.
Joana, can I ask you a question? 136 euros for 1 million dating profiles strikes me as very little, and it makes me feel that maybe our data is not worth very much. I mean, do you have any sense that companies sell this data and sell this profiling? In part, there's a kind of irony, which is that perhaps they oversell it because they need. You know, I was talking to a banker the other day who was party to a meeting with a big credit reference agency. The credit reference agency was trying to sell alternative data sources to the bank. The bank was like, this isn't even very good. This doesn't really help us predict fraud that well. So, I mean, do you think that data is valuable? What did the 1 million profiles for 136 euros make you think?
I mean, that's like a very context data, because it's data that's being sold in the online dating industry, which is sort of a well-established practice among dating sites. And in that case, yeah, like profiles in online dating sites are very cheap, because there is this need of constant flow of profiles in order to increase your chances of matching with people. Yeah? And that also raises another question, which means, and it's something that we found out in this particular project, that and that's actually what we research, is how many other third parties are being exploiting this data. Yeah, because I guess, as we said, there is so many data brokers exploiting like one single profile that, I mean, it has to be cheap for sure, right? Because you have to have a lot. So a lot of people can take profit, and you can take profit on the amount, more than on the detail at the end.
So what in that particular data set, who was exploiting it?
We found out altogether, more than 700 companies and online services were exploiting, not those exactly particularly, but dating profiles that have been part of the online dating site where these profiles were taken off, which is Plenty of Fish, which is part of Match Group, which also owns Tinder, OkCupid and so on. So it's like a big conglomerate of online dating sites. Yeah.
And how did you find out how many companies were exploiting it?
Just by researching, we just, when we bought the badge, we sort of did reverse engineering, and we found out for sure that it was from Plenty of Fish. And then we started to research like the parent and sister companies of Plenty of Fish. And then we started to analyze through different tools with Privacy Badger, with Disconnect, with what's the other one? I can't remember. One extension that sort of tracks online trackers. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can't.
Lightbeam.
Yeah, Lightbeam. My God, and I'm using it in daily basis. Sorry. So we just started to analyze like all the third party that were just about taking data, like sucking some data. We don't know exactly which one from those profiles as well. Yeah.
Paul? Just a quick follow-up on the economic argument. If we imagine just leaving the user and the key service and eliminating all those other stakeholders, and we think about money, funding this service with not data but money we bring, we could end up paying very little for this service we actually want. Yes, just by eliminating all the other intermediaries.
And correcting slightly the economic argument, from what I understood here, but I only heard this, it's worth $136 by the 700th time it is sold. You don't know how much it was sold for the first time around.
Right.
So obviously it was sold for more money, I would expect, if it's completely exclusive. And then the other thing is we don't know, maybe you do, but from how many sites it was taken. It might be just a few hours work for someone to scrape 5 million profiles, which, if you look at it, is not a bad return for that person.
Maybe we could pause for a bit and take some questions for the audience. If anyone has questions, if you just introduce yourself, where you're from. Yes, in the front. No, you.
Hi, my name is Daniel. I'm founder of a company called Cybert, and for the last 6.5 years, I've been developing a piece of technology that is used on 130,000 websites today to create transparency about the tracking going on the websites. So through that work, I've got quite big insights on what is going on websites around the world in terms of tracking. And I think part of the picture when we are talking about uncovering the hidden data system is also looking at normal websites like corporate websites, web shops, blogs, and so on. Because what we can see is that these sites are actually feeding enormously amounts of data about users into this ecosystem. It's basically a question of where's the data coming from when an ad is up for bid. And what we see is that it's actually data that's collected from any website you can imagine. And a lot of the tracking that is going on is also performed in a way that is not immediately visible to anybody in the browser, not even the company operating the website. So many of our customers, they are quite alarmed and shocked when they see the scan result of the website, because they did not expect that their users were, their privacy was infringed in that way that it is. And these data, they form the roots of this ecosystem. It's there. It's really starting. So. I think that's also why, Johnny, you mentioned the ad tech industry has not really seen any harm after the GDPR. I think part of the explanation is that it is not enforced on regular websites, so not many websites actually honor the requirement of prior consent. They don't give the users a real choice. So it can keep existing, doing the business that they have done so far.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, I think if I understood correctly, it seems like there's a question at the heart of that, which is that companies aren't really, they haven't really enforced GDPR, even though they've now kind of got slightly more annoying pop-ups than they used to have before. Do you think that companies have made changes, haven't? Why not? Could they get in trouble?
I can kick off by saying that my understanding is that especially companies from this hidden data ecosystem, they try hard to legalize what they have been doing years before under GDPR by getting, at least in Poland, they try to obtain consent that I would never really call consent, because it ends up having a long, the best case is that we have a pop-up saying, if you agree to whatever we do with your data, just move on. If you disagree, go deeper and deeper and deeper. And on the third page, you discover the long list, like hundreds of companies, sometimes pre-ticked, so you have to untick all of them to disagree, and that's called consent. And still, yet you know nothing about scale of data process, the real purposes for all those companies, because those might be different purposes. Yes, we are talking about data brokers who don't do advertising themselves. They have different purposes of processing data. They try to integrate our profiles. So they never reveal those purposes. They never reveal full scale of data as we claim in our complaints, showing that it can even include sensitive data. So there's no mentioning of the really dirty stuff there. And still, yet that this is called consent. So I'm afraid we just have to bring them to courts and DPAs and wait for DPAs to clarify the meaning of consent. I'm already quite happy with CNIL decision on Google, which sets the standard pretty high. If Google is in trouble, all the rest of those companies basically should get a fine with 10 plus and go bust.
Thank you. There's a question in the front here. Oh, yeah. Thank you.
An observation and then a question.
If you could just say who you are.
Sorry, Pat Walsh, Privacy Matters. Yeah. Sorry. I keep hearing, and we all keep hearing, that advertising supports a free internet. Advertising supports journalism, that if there isn't the current advertising model, journalism will die, right? And so I thought I would, hang on, this is gone again. I thought I would actually subscribe to a service where I paid Wired, for example, for a subscription. And I discovered, even with the description, that I was being tracked. And so I asked them about that. And they said, we do want you to be aware, with a Wired ad-free subscription, third-party requests are made to our analytics providers and personalization platforms. Most are to our internal systems, but we do allow a few third-party providers, including Facebook, Amazon, Google Analytics, to set cookies for analytics and social sharing. Each of those is meant to help improve your experience. Mm-hmm. So clearly I'm going to be digging a little bit further, because I have been doing this on my own. But in terms of the complaints so two things. In terms of the complaints that Johnny and NGOs have made, what has been the reaction of the DPAs? And then secondly, to the NGOs working in this space, do you think there's a need to develop, there are a few tools that will help people have transparency over what an ad, over what a website does, maybe not as much as you have found, but enough for other individuals. Do you think there's a need for a tool that gives people very clear, non-confusing information about the privacy implications of a site as they visit it?
Paul, do you want to take that? You've done a lot of tool building.
So I'll take the second one. So my view on the second one is that the funding models actually limit what is possible to do in that space. So everyone is trying to build their own visualization tool. You have Ghostery, you have Lightbeam, you have all those different initiatives, and they all work around the same principle. They observe your interaction with the page, and then they produce a visualization. So they do two things that they bundle together, and I find that unfortunate. I wish there would be a fragmentation, a more open approach to this, where there would be different tooling that observes what you're doing, and then a different set of tools that help you act, either to have a view or to have an access rights tool, to have a blocking tool, all of those things. So that's my view on the tooling that can happen.
Maybe one more question from the audience, then we go back to discussion.
There was the question on the DPA reaction that I think is super interesting.
What was the reaction to the DPA? Okay, DPAs like to say things like, we are talking with all stakeholders. No, they say, we are speaking with all stakeholders, and they make eye contact when they say that. We filed initially on the 12th of September, and I think well within 15 days, we had a case number from both DPAs that we, myself, Jim and Michael, were complaining to. So that was pretty fast on their part. We've had dialogue with them. The only way I can describe what we're doing with them is we are working closely with them to figure out, for them to figure out what's going on in this space. Now, there are people, if you think about the ICO, for example, there are people that the ICO has now hired whose expertise we respect. I didn't think I was saying anything controversial there at all. I mean, they do have some very... Is he here? So they have some good people. It takes a while, I think, for the corporate body to take a view on things. What they've told us is, look, we are going to be very, very careful in what we're doing. We're going to act on this. Ad tech is a priority area for us. We've heard informally that the ad tech zone of interest is, for them, the big deal after Cambridge Analytica. I would guess we're going to be another 6 months at this, I think. And I also think we're going to have appeals, and this is going to go all the way to the ECJ. But I also think the outcome is pretty inevitable. And it'd be great if we could just get this thing done already. Can I quickly say something else? On Keneal, the second last ad tech decision they came out with about Vectory, I found incredibly disappointing. Right? It was a good decision. It said Vectory shouldn't have had 5.5 million people's data that they hoovered up through their SDK with consent that was imperfect because it was based on the IAB system. Followed quite faithfully with one very minor deviation from a picture, not a piece of text guidance from the IAB. But Keneal also found, when they rated or visited Vectory in April last year, they found that Vectory had received 67.6 million people's data through the ad auction system. And the Keneal complaint says, okay, little company with 3.5 million turnover, you shouldn't have those data. Keneal didn't say, where did you get those data? There's only a few places they could have got them from, and they're all ad exchanges, or SSPs who work with ad exchanges. So Keneal could have saved us all a lot of trouble by going 1/2 mile extra and just gone up the chain and killed this thing and forced the exchanges to stop using personal data in RTB so that little companies of 3.5 million turnover can get almost 80 million people's data.
Question in the front.
Yes, I have a question. There's currently the Fashion ID case that we are waiting for what the European Court of Justice is going to say about that, which basically is about the company that has a Facebook like button on their website. Are they also responsible for the data processing that is going on as a result of having the Facebook like button on the website? And related to Daniel's question, and also the feeling I got on this panel is like, do you believe that indeed these small companies should also be responsible? Or do you believe, no, the responsibility should only be pushed upwards to like the main players within the ecosystem? I see now that the Advocate General in that case is kind of saying, well, no, the responsibilities for the small players should be limited. And I see how that feels reasonable. But on the other hand, from a more economic point of view, you could say, well, if we pressure all the people in the, or all the organizations in the ecosystem, then the chance of cleaning the system up will be bigger. And I would like to know.
Great question. Can you just say who you are?
I'm René Mailleux from the University of Brussels.
Great, thank you. Yeah, Paul.
So I would say that on the Cambridge Analytica scandal, which was really important, was that there were two players. It was clearly Facebook and Cambridge Analytica, and they were bouncing in from, they didn't have the full picture, either of them, and they were external, the media and other people who wanted to really get to more of the truth. So they were put constant pressure. So to answer your question, I think the right strategy is to use Article 26 on joint controllership. It's definitely a processing operation to transfer data from one place to another, one controller to another. And we know that Facebook at the end is controller for part of that data. So there is a step, there is a last step where there is a joint controllership, a transfer. The point is to ask about that specific transfer across the ecosystem for everyone, and to be very clear about how the small players, who they should resolve those questions with, and to send all the small players to the same entity on the big players' side. So to suddenly turn the whole power of the market against the big ones, and to resolve that junction point, that interface first, and then to see how the chips fall. That is the right strategy, according to me.
It's really, really interesting idea. I was struck covering the Cambridge Analytica scandal by the fact that the much-awaited ICO report that came out at the end of it, investigating this whole thing, kind of revealed not much more than had been revealed by The Guardian months before. And I kind of just building on the point Pat made, I wonder, I mean, are data protection watchdogs just unable to kind of pay the salaries or retain the staff? They have really high levels of staff turnover to really get to this issue and change the way that data privacy is understood.
I can only hope that in the Cambridge Analytica case, facts were pretty clear, and I don't think we had big controversy around what has happened. So maybe this is why we didn't really need more investigation. That case is different because we have no idea, at least me as user, I have no idea what is happening inside. So therefore, we really need to get the big ones, at least force them to have open conversation with us about what is happening inside of those ecosystems, because we don't have as clear proof as we had in the Facebook case regarding the powers of DPAs to tackle this. I think, yes, we struggle with lack of balance here. I mean, all the best people who know the stuff are in private market. Polish DPA got a budget from the state, got its budget to employ 100 new people in June, I think, last year. So 1 month after GDPR started being operational, and everybody, as you know, was already busy implementing GDPR for private companies. So competing with salaries was impossible, but even if they had competitive salaries, the DPA, the timing was quite wrong. Everybody was already busy working for Facebook's, Google's, and data brokers. So yes, it is a challenge. Therefore, at least in Polish case, we hope that our DPA will join transnational investigation, and hopefully not just with the Irish and UK DPA, but also with others, maybe including CNIL, that is famous for having actually quite significant expertise in tech. The only way here to achieve something is to cooperate across EU, and this is what we are hoping for.
And what about the whole jurisdictional question? Like, you know, Google is now appealing its fine, and it's quickly signed up with the Irish DPA. Do you think that CNIL does have a reputation of being kind of tougher than the other regulators? So, I mean, do you think that companies are going to play the system?
Going to continue playing the system?
Continue playing the system.
We have Article 62, if I'm not mistaken, of GDPR actually forcing them to cooperate. And if there is this situation where, say, lead authority, say Irish authority, has a different opinion than, say, French authority, we have mechanism built in GDPR to prevent race to the bottom here. And our last resource, and maybe our best hope, is that European Data Protection Board will issue its opinion here. So I don't think we have to be worried so much about lead authority having a very gentle grip on those big players, as long as we have this transnational procedure in place.
And, on Cambridge Analytica, I want the report that was issued is only the interim report. There's still another report due, from what I hear, in the coming weeks, so very soon. It was also done under the directive, or the UK law translating the directive, not under the GDPR yet. So the Data Protection Authority didn't have all the powers it needed. But one very important...
But they didn't have the passwords to the servers.
So for instance, they didn't have the password, but one important aspect is that part of this inquiry went forward simply because there was an individual who had made an access request. And the password they have now, and it seems that it's directly related to them finding themselves in court in front of David Carroll's lawyer, trying to argue this case around an access request. So it's not just regulators on their own. It also needs pressure of individuals, in my view.
Sorry, go on, Johnny.
I was just coming back to that, I guess, complexity of cases versus isn't the public service something that we're never sure can quite stand up to the private sector argument. In the case that we're involved in, actually, the facts are incredibly simple. There are 2 documents that define how the industry ought to work. You can't participate in the industry if you don't do what these documents say. So you read the documents and the examples in the documents, and it's very clear what's going on. This is not rocket science. It's reading documents. There's only 2 of them. So the level of complexity is not always that high. But even if it were, we forget, actually, that the public service is the public service, and that there are people there who choose to be there, who make less than they made in their last job. I can think of some people in data protection regulation that definitely does apply to. They make less than they made in their last job. They make less than they'll make in their next job, God help us, when they move. They are there working hard, working longer than their competitors, their opponents in a sense, on the other side. And they're doing it because they're moral people in the public interest. They're exactly who you want there. They're warrior monks. And it's okay to have warrior monks. We should respect them a little bit more than we do. Especially when the case is simple. Warrior monks can cut through that pretty quickly.
We're running out of time, so if we can just move back to questions from the audience, and if you could try and keep your questions short and remember to introduce yourself, that would be great. There's a lady in the front, in the middle front. Thank you.
A short and practical question. And sorry, my name is Ine van Zeeland. I'm also at the Free University of Brussels. Say you are an online publisher and you've been established for a while, and now you want to disentangle from this advertising-based model. How would you go about that?
May I give a quick practical answer? And that is, there is no easy way for you to do that today. You're caught in a prisoner's dilemma. If you decide that your bid requests into this ad auction system are going to have no personal data in them, and if I am your competitor and I don't make that decision, my bid requests will receive more money than yours. Now, the New York Times is unusual. It's in a position to do that, and it was reported with very little detail that actually they made more money in Europe once they stopped putting personal data in the bid request in Europe. I wouldn't stand over that yet. We don't have enough information about why that was. You need to wait until the entire market agrees. We are now going to play on a level playing field with no personal data in bid requests. At that point, you will be making out like a bandit, and clickbait will go off into a corner and die.
Any more questions? Maybe time for one more hit. There's, oh, right, yeah.
Hey, I'm Felix Bauer. I'm a co-founder of AirCloak. We do data anonymization. And I have a question regarding this inferred data when it comes to the advertising networks. So the lady on the right here, Katarzyna, is that the name? So you mentioned that there's these 3 layers, and I found that a really interesting way of putting it. The third one being inferred. Now, and it's difficult to get to these data. But my question is that actually really personal? Isn't that IP of the company that creates this data? They put in the research. They somehow try to figure out what your browsing behavior and what your personal information means on a third level. And so is that actually something you should be able to access? And secondary, if, for example, they say you have a certain illness because you've been Googling about it, turns out you don't have that, isn't that their problem? Why is it yours?
I think in the short time I have today, I will not give you full answer, but tomorrow morning at 8:45, we have whole panel on this very question, so please do come and we will continue this discussion. In my opinion, GDPR clearly gives us full control over our personal data, so as long as this third layer is attributed to a user with specific ID, that user has right to control it. Of course, the company might take a different approach and might anonymize this third layer, and in such case, we cannot control it. But that's on the side of the company. If they create categories of people without identifying users, yes, they can escape control. But if they decide, as we believe they do in the hidden data ecosystem, they actually combine those categories with specific users. If they make that step, they also have to be liable for making that step. So in a way, it's up to the company to shape how they deal with this inferred data, and the IP here is protected because GDPR does not require them to reveal the logic of profiling, which could infringe intellectual property, but does require them to reveal the result of this exercise, being your personal data.
Just one final question from the front, and then hand back to Ailidh.
Thank you. Elis Latifi, I used to work for the CNIL and EDPS, partly with these two, so maybe not worth of respect today. But now I work as an independent consultant in privacy, so I saw the model access request that you provided, that you gave. From regulator point of view, I'd say it's brilliant, and also from my part, because I'm still passionate about privacy. But from the consultant point of view, when I advise startups, so I'm not working for data brokers, I feel frightened receiving this type of request, because it seems to assume that the data is all in one place, and it's not the case. So would you also find it interesting to research on tools that would help SMEs to answer this type of request, to search the data and put it in one place and being able to clearly answer requests?
Thank you for the question. It's a really good question. It's also part of the answer that I would have given to you, who was asking about newspapers. You can go and you can map your processors. You can do it on Wikidata. You can add the link between your controllers and the processors. It's just a matter of the client becoming slightly more, the tool, the client becoming slightly more intelligent when making the request to assist the controller in sourcing the data from the processors as well, right? So there's a standard called OpenGDPR that is precisely there to help controllers interact with their processors. So there is some tooling that's evolving, and if you do it open source instead of buying from vendors whose interests are not exactly well aligned there, I think we can very quickly get a lot of transparency from this ecosystem.
Thanks very much, everyone. Thank you for some great questions.
I just wanted to finish with just a couple of remarks. I think we talked a lot the beginning about the economic arguments, and I think there it's also important to return to the fact that the right to data protection and privacy are fundamental rights, and that's the context that we're talking in. And that we've talked also about the tools that people have, and this is important, but the responsibility shouldn't lie solely on the individuals. And I think that's why we're calling on the regulators to take action against the frameworks that govern this, and that's really important. But also to make examples of the companies that fail to comply. So I think what we really want is the regulators to step up their game and respond to the various complaints that have happened already, and for the companies to implement the law, but also to be more transparent. So thanks very much for coming along, and hopefully this time next year there'll be some movement.